And we're live, basically. Mr. Barsky, Jack, welcome to our podcast. Thank you very much for taking a portion out of your time on a Saturday to be here.
Yeah, glad to talk to somebody from a country which I have never had the pleasure to visit. One of those days, maybe we'll make it.
Yeah, hopefully so that we can have a face-to-face, basically like a face-to-face conversation. I just wanted to start this with a preface. I've started reading a lot more this year than I did during the previous years, a whole lot more. And like 5 is more than 1. So, and your book is hands down the best one that I read so far. Your whole life, your whole experience, not just tied to the spying experience, the spying life in and of itself, but your whole intrinsic life and experience has been really, really remarkable. And I'm going to make sure to put the link down in the description below so that everybody, and I say everybody who is even remotely interested in learning about your life and how it is to be a spy, a KGB spy, can actually visit, see the book, and purchase it.
Well, thanks for the compliment. I just got to say one thing, and that's not false humility. I really can't take credit for all of this stuff. What I can take credit for is, I stumbled into situations, things were brought to me, things happened to me. What I can take credit for is how I responded. But there was no planning, there was no design. I know a lot of folks who, when they were, say, in high school, they already had their life planned out, and they actually achieved what they were looking for. I'm going to go to law school. I'm going to be I had no such ideas. Even starting with what to study. I I was very reactive in my entire life, and still am.
Yeah, knowing basically how to respond and how to recognize a good opportunity. And, just to take the viewers, let's actually approach it like this. So for those who haven't heard about you, who haven't heard about your life, could you just please share perhaps like a brief overview of who you are, who you have
Sure.
been, and what you have been doing?
Okay, so this is the short version summary of a book that is 320 pages long. Was born 1949, just about this time in May, in a far southeastern corner of East Germany, which is like this was right next to the border with the Czech Republic and Poland, and it was a very, very rural, backwards area of Germany, and at the time was Soviet occupied. Grew up in a small village and later on in a small town. My parents were both teachers, so standard of living by comparison to the rest of the folks was pretty good. But nevertheless, post-World War II, living was not easy. It was a whole lot there were food shortages. We had food rationing until I was 10 years old. And quite frankly, I can never remember having gone hungry. But I also cannot remember for the first 10, 11 years of my life having had a meal that really tasted good. My mother once told me that she took one egg and fed 3 people from that. I did not dare ask her what she used to stretch that egg. So, and it was all about the basics of food, clothing, shelter, toys. For Christmas you got one, and the rest of your Christmas presents were things that you didn't want to have, but you had to have, like clothes and stuff like that. I did really well in school, and which got me admitted to high school in Germany. It's called gymnasium, and it's only the top 10-15% of the students went on to high school. And I did really well in high school. I got nothing but A's or 1s in Germany, and that got me into university. I studied chemistry, and I again was the best, not just one of the best. I was the best student. There wasn't really a close second. Now, This is not necessarily because I'm so damn smart. It had a lot to do with being smart, but also I had phenomenal work habits. I worked my butt off. And chemistry is the sciences that when you study that have lab involved are very demanding. So, the other thing that happened from childhood on, we were indoctrinated with the communist ideology, kindergarten, elementary school, middle school, high school, university. So eventually, if you hear only one worldview and nothing competing, you buy into it. And quite frankly, the idea of communism and that everybody just get along and everybody is doing well and there's not some very rich people and some very poor people, it's very appealing. Very appealing, and its appeal is showing up again in today's Western society, where young people and some older think it's a great idea and maybe we should try it again. It just doesn't work, right? So, but we didn't know that, and it was at the time I was in college when the Vietnam War was the most unpopular event on the world scene, which helped further. Confirm that my worldview was correct, that the Americans were evil and West Germany had some ex-Nazis in the government. So, communist, active in the youth movement at the university, I received a scholarship, a national scholarship, that was given to, it could only have 100 concurrent holders. In other words, if you wanted to give another person this scholarship, another one, first a opening had to be. So I was like really standout, and that caught the attention of the KGB. I was already in my third year. I was approached by KGB, and it was a rather lengthy process of getting to know you. It wasn't like, hey, would you want to come work with us? Not at all. It was, getting to know each other. They were looking at me as potentially somebody very special because of, what you could find in my files. And so for a year and a half, I met this guy, and we talked about everything, and he got to know me, and I got to know him and what it's like, what it might be like to become an agent, an undercover agent. Initially, the thought was to send me to West Germany. That was obviously, that was pretty obvious. And so at one point I had to make a decision when in Berlin, the head of the East German division of the KGB asked me point blank whether, I would join or not. Now, I wasn't really prepared for that question to be, delivered. And he gave me overnight until the next middle of the day to come up with an answer. And it was really, it wasn't that easy because, I was going to have a phenomenal career. The town where I studied, I liked it. It was a university town. I was going to be one of the elite there. This was lining up really good. But then there was the world out there, the adventure and the ability to make a difference in history. And eventually what won was two things: the adventure, because I knew I was going to be able to travel. We had lots of travel restrictions going in the Western direction. And I wanted to see France, Italy, most of Europe. I didn't think so much about the United States. And the other thing was, when and this is a quote from Kim Philby, who was one of the most famous KGB agents, an Englishman. Kim Philby answered that question, why he joined the KGB. He said, if you are recruited by the most powerful intelligence agency in the world, you don't think very long about it. Flattery, all of a sudden, I internally, I had an elevated status. And one other thing that I didn't know would work out that way, but it turned out by joining the KGB, I had an existence outside of the law. right? For instance, I traveled between Berlin and Moscow by plane maybe a dozen times, never went through passport control, always went through the back door. I was encouraged to read Western literature when in general it was forbidden, and the Stasi would harass you for doing that. And I like that because I didn't like rules a lot. So that's now I'm okay. So now I'm moving to Berlin. I get training, and it turned out, and I needed to learn a language. That was a requirement. It turns out that I was really, really talented with regard to picking up English without much of an accent. And at one point, it was determined that there may be a chance that I actually could go to the United States if I work really hard to get rid of that accent and, get very fluent in English. So I moved for 2 years. They moved me to Moscow, where I had a Native American who had emigrated from the United States as a tutor. And we did phonetic exercises. I met her twice a week in our apartment, half-hour phonetic exercises. In the evening, I did phonetic exercises. And slowly but surely, I got to a point where it was determined I was good enough to wind up in New York City. Mind you, New York City was important because in Chicago that wouldn't have worked. But in New York City, there's all kinds of accents and all kinds of different people. So to go to New York City under with the pretension that I was actually born in the United States, and that was sort of the crown jewel, the greatest way to smuggle an illegal into the country, rather than going through, say, like they usually did, getting, say, false check papers, wind up in Canada, establish themselves in Canada, and then move to the US. I went there in 1978, and I'm Jack Barsky. That birth certificate, it was an authentic copy of a birth certificate for Jack Barsky, who was a young man who passed away at the age of 11. And then it took me a year to acquire the documentation that you need to live and work in the U.S., particularly a driver's license and a Social Security card. Social Security, you couldn't find employment without having Social Security. That took about a year. It wasn't that easy. And then my first job, since I couldn't take any of my qualifications with me, such as having knowledge of chemistry, which after 5 years of KGB training had faded anyway. So my first job, I had to find something where A, you didn't need qualifications, and B, they wouldn't bother to check your background. And so I found something that fit rather well. I became a bike messenger in Manhattan. And it fit well also because this was contract work, and you were paid by the package, which was way, way above minimum wage. And within 6 months working there, I had enough savings and enough income that I could finally rent an apartment and also tell the KGB that I don't need extra funds anymore, because transferring funds into enemy territory has always been a somewhat dangerous operation. That's contact with somebody who is most likely known to counterintelligence as an agent. So, and it went on. I went back to college in the United States. I finished a 4-year program in 3 years, and the first year I was still working part-time. And this is not necessarily bragging, but I think it's really funny and ridiculous and unique. I became the valedictorian. I didn't know that. I just said, what the heck, I'm going to see if I can get all A's, as I usually do. And when I did, I was told that I have to give a speech at graduation. I said, wow, you're a valedictorian. So as a result, which was somewhat risky because I spoke in front of 10,000 people at Madison Square Garden. And I was 10 years older than the average student, having finished this program in 3 years, having entered that school with a high school equivalency diploma. Nobody was curious about this guy. It was fundamentally very dangerous. I didn't even make the front page of the school newspaper, thank God. But you know, the bizarre thing about this is that an active KGB agent was the #1 graduate in the United States business school. I think it's funny. Got a job as a computer programmer for MetLife Insurance Company, and loved it. I really loved that job. I loved it, what I was doing, my colleagues. It was, you know, for the first time since I stopped doing chemistry and math, you know, I was intellectually engaged again. And there was a moment, maybe a year into that employment, that I was thinking to myself, you know I have to eventually leave the country. I'm going to miss these people. I'm going to miss that job. Now that wasn't anywhere near, you know, thinking about defecting, but there was this a seed in my brain that I was starting to become what the KGB wanted me to become, an American, right? So in 1988, I got what we called an emergency signal. We had a system of signals, and one of them was the loudest of them. There was a fist-sized red dot at a particular spot that I would see on my way to work. And the emergency signal meant you're in immediate danger. Flee, get out of the country as quickly as you can. And that was a dilemma, because this is one thing that the KGB didn't know, and I knew that they didn't know that. I didn't know, but I had very good reason to believe, because if they had known, I would have been reprimanded severely, and they would have called me back sooner. So I had an 18-month-old child, a daughter at the time, and this was the first time in my life that I was stricken by what I call an attack of unconditional love. I think fathers of girls can probably understand what I was feeling, because apparently there seems to be a very special relationship between a dad and his daughter. I have another one now, and it's the same thing. So anyway, I just didn't want to leave her. It was another one of those difficult decisions, because by not obeying the KGB, I put myself in danger, not only that the FBI might arrest me, but also that the KGB would not be very nice to me after I tell them that I'm not obeying their command. And going home would have meant nothing but good for me, because I had a lot of dollar savings in Moscow. They had promised me a house. I would have gone back, highly regarded, but there was this little girl, and it was like back and forth. Eventually, the girl won. So, and I told I wrote a resignation letter to the KGB in secret writing. That's probably unusual too. And I told them that the reason I am not going back was that I had contracted HIV/AIDS. And in 1988, that was fundamentally a death sentence. There was no cure for it. And it was also highly infectious. So the last thing that they would want is somebody with AIDS in their country. And I didn't know this until much, much later. They believed it, and they told my German family that I had died from HIV/AIDS. And so they didn't bother me anymore. And at one point, I knew that that they had gotten the letter and they had digested things when they stopped transmitting shortwave radio messages. That's when I threw the radio in the Hudson River and started building my version of the American dream. About a year later, I bought a house I got married to the mother of the girl. We had another child, and for another 9 years, I lived like an average American with a great career. I made quite a bit of money in information technology, moved to the countryside in Pennsylvania. But, you know, the past caught up with me, and the past caught up with me in such a way that in 1992, there was a defection from I don't know if it was still the KGB. The Soviet Union didn't exist anymore, but there was still lots and lots of remnants of the KGB, and they had a security apparatus as well. Anyway, there was a defection by a fellow who had worked many years in the archives of the KGB, and he had access to lots and lots of records, particularly espionage related. And he contacted the British intelligence service, MI6, and eventually they got him out with 5 suitcases worth of material. It was the greatest treasure ever delivered in the history of espionage. Hundreds of agents that were still out there were unmasked. Lots and lots of information came out, and amongst that information there was a little bit of a blurb, maybe like 5-6 lines about Jack Barsky living as an undercover agent somewhere in the northeast of the United States. So when the FBI got that, they were looking for Jack Barsky, and there weren't too many of those, and I fit the profile. So they spent 3 years investigating me, because all they knew was that I was a really well-trained agent, and what they didn't know whether I was still active or I was a sleeper to be woken up. So they just watched me, and they watched me. They even bought the house next door. And when eventually the lead agent convinced his bosses that I was not active anymore, he got permission to introduce himself. So one day there was a fake traffic stop at a toll gate, where there was a cop who waved me to the side and told me to please step out of the car. It's routine, he said. But then that agent fellow came up to me, and he showed me his ID and he said, "FBI, we would like to talk to you." Now that was a surprise. I had, at that point, I had literally forgotten that I ever was a spy. I was just a very good IT technician who made a lot of money, had 2 kids, and had a nice house. So yeah, well, so I had to. I fully cooperated with the FBI. There was no more reason for me to hide anything. First of all, the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore. East Germany didn't exist anymore. I had completely lost any trace of my Marxist-Leninist foundation, because I found out by doing research that we were lied to a lot. And the good thing about that was, at that time when I started doing the research, after the wall came down in 1989, you could find out so much more without going to the library, through the internet. Mm-hmm. And so I wound up. They allowed me to. I didn't spend a single night in a jail. I passed a lie detector test, and I continued working with the FBI on certain things. And eventually I got a green card, and 6 years ago, I became a U.S. citizen. And when I got my passport, the first thing I did is plan a trip into the past. I thought I would never, ever see Germany again. And so I traveled to Germany and met lots of people that were classmates of mine, family. I had 2 sons in Germany, the places where I grew up. And I was also discovered by Der Spiegel, a German news magazine, and they wrote a lengthy article about me, which got to the United States 60 Minutes, which is the oldest and most popular news magazine in the entire world. And they came and and did a program about me that was watched by 15 million people. So that was the end of my privacy. And it was also the end of my last job because I got fired from that job, which allowed me, I had the time to write a book. It's Deep Undercover. And then the book got translated into German. So I had a lengthy book tour through Germany. It was just my life became really, really interesting. And up until COVID, I also did a lot of public appearances at all kinds of gatherings, altogether in 4 different countries, including the United States, half the states. So that's it. And I'm now living in Georgia, outside of Atlanta, in a very big house with my wife, my 10-year-old daughter Trinity, my wife's mother, a stepson, and his wife. There's too many adults in this house, but it is what it is. It's big enough to hold us all. And that's all I can tell you. And the adventure is not finished. I'm working on a podcast. This is a 12 episode series. It's a audio drama based on my book. It's going to come out sometime this summer. It's called The Agent. It will be available free of charge because then they're going to put some ads in there. It's professionally done. It's not. I'm not doing it. I'm collaborating, and there's always a possibility that we may get a movie or a series done. So life's good. Life's interesting, and I get to know interesting people, including you. So. The end of the introduction. I'm sorry, it was a bit long.
No. I loved it, and thank you for the compliment, among other things. But that, like, one of the things that you mentioned, like in your last couple of lines, is like, I'm wondering why there hasn't been a movie done, and I'm not sure, like, what are the things that most people are fascinated with when they come to hear and read about your story.
I can tell you why. Hollywood is extremely competitive. Producers get stuff put on their disc on a daily basis. They can't read all of it. They don't read books. They read summaries. And here's what I ran into. And actually, the 60 Minutes producer, who's highly decorated, he has 7 Emmys. He predicted people would be competing. Well, here's the problem. So the summary says, it just doesn't give you the entire flavor, and you picked it up. This is not a spy story. It's a psychological drama. It has a lot to do with human emotions, love, and so forth, against the background of the Cold War and espionage. This is what we ran into, and at this point, we're not anymore. At the time when this was proposed to Hollywood, there was the series running The Americans. Mm-hmm. The Americans is about an illegal couple, Russian spies, doing all kinds of crazy things in the United States. And so the response from the production companies was, well, it looks like The Americans. We don't want to do that again. And we don't want to compete with that because The Americans was highly regarded. So it is what it is. The Americans is done. And, spy stories are always, will always be popular. And the thing is, and this had happened to you and many, many others, when serious people in the business actually read the book, they say, oh my God, this is really good. And so the contract that I have with a company that is making the podcast has a provision that they might actually go further and do something for the screen, for a big screen or a small screen, depending upon how well the podcast does.
Yeah, I mean, that would be fantastic because, like, I mean, yes, it's a psychological drama, but okay, let's like take it back a little bit. Take it to the University of Jena or Jena. I'm not sure how to
No,
pronounce it.
Jena,
Jena.
Jena.
Yeah, basically, it's Jena. It's German. I mean, why would
Very
it be
good.
Jena?
Yes.
I mean, ich kenne ein bisschen Deutsch.
Huh.
I've been learning it. This, if my professor of German is listening to this, I'm sorry. I know that I wasn't a good student. I know a little bit, ambition or something like that. What I want to say was basically like back at the University of Vienna, that approach and that knock on your dorm door by the KGB and
Yeah.
the subsequent training, both in the Jena, both in Berlin and Moscow, how did it all look like? Because I'm really interested into the training itself, basically, which
Yeah.
you divided into spycraft and soft skills. How did the beginning training look like?
Now, let's just first talk about what the KGB recruiters were looking for.
Okay. Mhm.
Because unlike the CIA takes in a lot of would-be agents, and they all send them through school. There's a very well constructed curriculum that includes all kinds of things, and they have weapons training, they have psychological training, they have people skills training, tradecraft, everything. I don't know how. I know this because I'm friends with several ex-CIA agents. The KGB did it completely different. They were looking for particular people, and I'm going to read off. I found this, and there was a couple of interviews that were given by high-level KGB officers after they retired and after the Soviet Union was gone. And they they shared how they were fishing for people like me and what they were looking for. And literally, they said they would screen thousands of people, and then would wind up maybe with hundreds of candidates, and then eventually, at the time, they sent me to the United States. According to this guy who smuggled the information out of the KGB archives, there were 9 others. So there was a process of elimination, and I want to read this off the main character traits, and obviously we had to be communists. I mean, we had to be like strong communists. That was a foundation. But here goes the other things: quickness of intellect, high erudition, meaning a lot of knowledge about a lot of stuff, mental and emotional toughness, language abilities, bravery, focus, quick response to fluid situations, hardiness to stress, adaptation to completely new conditions of life. Well, this is my favorite. Well-controlled inclination to adventure.
You fit right
That was
in.
me. Ease of transformation. And guess what? That was me.
It's all of your traits.
Huh?
All of your traits were right there.
Pretty much. And the the year and a half in Jena where I was meeting with this guy, he was interacting with me in such a way to find out what I have, because the KGB did very little of the structured training that the CIA did. They knew that in illegal, you cannot prepare for what's going to happen. You can't. You need people that can make decisions on the spot, make right decisions, be brave, and not be scared of things that might go wrong, and are emotionally tough. So these are the basics, and so when I got the invitation to join, they had determined that I had what it takes. That doesn't mean that I was already completely in. So I give you my first test. There were 2 tests while I was in Berlin that could have disqualified me. The first one, I show up in Berlin. I quit the job at the university. I show up in Berlin with a suitcase, and I meet my new handler, Nikolai. We get in a car, and I figured he would take me to my new apartment. No, he said, the first task you have is to find yourself a place to live. That was an impossible task. In those days, all apartments, houses, all places where you could live were controlled by the government. And there was a long waiting list. There was nothing available. Now, there were most likely some people who rented illegally, but if you come as a stranger into a new city, how do you find those? You know, that would have to be word of mouth, and you have to live there for a while. So, shoot. Well, I managed to actually find something way outside of Berlin by running around and knocking on doors and asking people, and eventually found a house that had an outbuilding. This is what was in the outbuilding. There was a room with a bed and a chair. In the next small room, there was running cold water. That I lived in that place for 6 months. If I don't find anything, I don't know. I'm dead, because this was a task. I didn't know it at the time. I just did what they told me to do. The second one, I found out that this was definitely a test. Maybe a year into my training in Berlin, they sent me to West Berlin. I traveled there with a passport with my real name, and all I had to do was just take some transportation, look around, just get a feel for the place. Now, you see, this was enemy territory, and I knew that I was the enemy to them. It was a test too, because to me it was nothing, literally. After the first 15 minutes, where I thought, oh, maybe people can find out, sort of look at me funny because I was wearing, Eastern clothes. But nothing, so no problem. But I met an old friend of mine by accident who had joined the Stasi, East German secret police, and they sent him to West Berlin also. And he returned and told them, I can't do this. Mm. I'm too afraid. So guess what happened to him? He was let go and never found a job as an engineer again. He was a trained engineer, so he had to, get by doing other things. So these were the two tests. Once I passed them, they knew I had what it takes. And I also got a bunch of tasks. So, for instance, my second visit in West Berlin, I actually had a task to go to a particular apartment where there was an older couple who had a relative in the West, and I was to befriend them and find out something about that relative. So I came up with a cover story. I told them that I was a student at the Free University, and then I'm doing a survey. And so while I was doing the survey, eventually we started doing small talk, and I guess I was a likable guy because they liked me, and they invited me again to have some coffee. And eventually I came back with the information. All of this is all basic requirements. You can't have a shy person as an agent. The person needs to be able to interact with people. How do you find that out? Anybody can claim it. It needs to be put to the test. So that's a long answer to this. But the second part of the answer is there were never any classes. There wasn't even when I started in Berlin, I never saw a piece of paper that says you're going to do this, 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 and this. My handler just told me, all right, we're going to learn cryptography. That means encryption and decryption of messages, secret writing, tradecraft as to pertains to operations in the streets outside, dead drop operations, counter surveillance, and photography and Morse code, because I would receive, for 10 years, I would receive my instructions over shortwave radio Morse code. And then the other thing that I was told to do, you need to expand your general knowledge of the world. So read authors from different countries, go to the opera, theater, museums, and so forth. They paid for all of this. That was fun. And so once a month I had to write a report, what I did. But it was unstructured, completely unstructured. They relied on me to take the initiative. And they already knew I would, because, you know, that I had proven that in my interaction with them, but primarily the way I studied at university. And the last thing that I was required to do is learn a foreign language. And they gave me a choice. And I said, well, you know, English came really easy to me in high school. So I said, I'm going to learn English. And so I threw myself into this. There was no real goal, just learn the language. But, you know, always wanting to be the best, I can prove this to myself. I learned 100 new words every day for almost a year. How do I know this? Because I had a system of index cards, and I counted the cards, and I also made sure that, let's say, one card, I would know this word means this in English and this in German. I would put it aside, but a couple of months later, I would pick it up again to make sure that I really remember it. So I can prove to myself that I learned that many words, and it was way too many. You know, because when you learn another language that way, you learn synonyms that nobody uses, right? And it happened to me even, you know, several years into my operating as an American, that people would tell me, you use some really strange words. Now, they were perfectly good words, but again, people don't use them, and sometimes they wouldn't even understand them. So, so this was all book knowledge. And but what really, as I said before, interested them was my ability to speak really well. And so that's how I wound up in Moscow and eventually in the United States rather than in West Germany. And in Moscow, the training was better, particularly counter surveillance and you know, the street operations. I mean, I worked with the very best. The coach, so to speak, the guy, he was in charge of a bunch of groups that would follow Western diplomats, people of interest, and we did tests. You know, I had to once in a while, my handler would come to my apartment in the morning and says, "Time to go check." So I go out there and run around in Moscow for 3 hours roughly. And go to places where somebody who follows me, and that was a team of about 8 people. One of those guys would have to be close enough so I can see their face, because the point being, if you surveil somebody, you want to know at all times what they're doing, because it takes only 10 seconds for a brush pass where you meet somebody else and quickly hand something over or take something. So. So after 3 hours, if you see the same face twice, you know that you're being followed. I think we did about 10 exercises. Sometimes I had nobody following me, and sometimes I did. And the end score was 10-0. I won every time, and they were serious. I mean, for them it was an exercise too, right? They had to write reports, and the guy gave me really a big compliment. He said I was one of the best. And you know why? What helped me in those days? My memory for faces was extraordinary. You know, I had I don't know. Nowadays it's not that good anymore. You know, as you get older, there are memory issues. But in those days I was really sharp. The hardest thing to determine is, and then write in the report, I was not followed, because that you can't really prove it. It's just you got to have trust in that. If you had been followed, you would have noticed. Anyway, so the training in Moscow was really good, and what was completely missing, and I cannot understand why they never gave me psychological exams, tests, not a one. They did not prepare me psychologically. They just knew that I had what it took, right? And the other thing, cultural training was very deficient. You know, it's one thing to speak the language, it's another thing to have a book knowledge about, you know, study the map of New York City, study the map of Washington, D.C., learning about, you know, American heroes' history, but I was never taught how Americans act, what it's like to be an American, with a few basics here and there. But I had to very carefully acquire this myself, and this was not planned by anybody. But when I took that job at the messenger company, it was a perfect entry into American society, because my colleagues were not curious. They didn't give a damn as to who was there. A lot of them were transients. You know, there were people who would work there for 6 months and then go back to whatever they were doing or not doing. And I was able to just listen and observe. And that really helped me. If I had, let's say, if they had sent me to a city that was not New York, any other city pretty much, and I had taken a job where I had been surrounded by curious and intelligent people, I would have been busted. So, you know, it's a mixture of ability, being analytical, doing the right things, but also luck.
Yeah.
I should not have survived, and I'm wondering what the other. I know one of those guys I actually met, of my colleagues, one of the 10 that was sent over. He didn't have a task, and he came in with an accent that he could explain. I don't know exactly what route he took, but he had no real tasks. So, and he got himself a job in IT, and but again, also in New York. This was a mission that I was sent on that was really bound to fail. And I got to say that there was luck involved for sure.
But what was your actual mission? What were your tasks during your stay in New York for those 10 years as an undercover KGB agent? What did you, which sort of information did you have to send back to the center, as they say, to the KGB headquarters?
This may not be a surprise that was unstructured as well. The one specific concrete task I had was in the beginning, you know, get the documentation that will allow you to work and live as an American. And for that, I got specific instructions, and they turned out to be flawed. And I had to, you know, improvise and find a way around what they told me that didn't work. Generally, I was my overall task was to do political espionage. In other words, particularly in the realm of foreign policy, not military, certainly not industrial espionage, and certainly not sabotage or anything like that. So I was I was given the names of some organizations that they were interested in. They still exist. The Hudson, I just missed it. The Hudson Institute, which is a conservative think tank. In those days, the School of International Relations at Columbia University was of great interest because the head of that school was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was just, at one point the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter. We all hated Brzezinski because he was a pain in the neck. He was pushing the human rights agenda big time. Well, we didn't know that Brzezinski was nothing compared to Henry Kissinger.
To say the least.
Kissinger and Ronald Reagan, my goodness. Jimmy Carter was relatively easy. So I was, they said it would be great if you can make friends in some of these organizations. Oh, the Trilateral Commission. I don't know why they thought the Trilateral Commission was such an important organization. I think they still exist, but they're really, I don't know if they do something. Nobody knows what they're doing. But that, for me to make friends in those circles, that required a certain standing in society. As a messenger, I clearly couldn't do it. And then as a student, particularly a student who is, with my shady background, quote unquote, 10 years older, and my backstory had me work on a farm. This was not the best setup to become friendly with really bright people, right? In that respect, I failed, but this was bound to fail. The things that I did send over on a regular basis is reports about reactions of Americans to international events. Now, why was that valuable? Because I lived among Americans, and the diplomat spies, the KGB agents who were under diplomatic cover, they read the New York Times and then sent a report to the Central Committee. So I believe my reports in that respect were somewhat helpful. And the other thing where I clearly cannot say whether what I did had any value to the KGB, I was supposed to act as a spotter, talent spotter. And so every time I made friends with somebody new, I would send a profile to the KGB. Who they are, what they do, weaknesses, strengths, possible angle to recruit them. Particularly of interest were the students that I met, because they could wind up in positions of interest. They would never tell you what they did with that information. That was part of compartmentalization and keeping things secret.
Yeah, I remember that guy. I believe his name was Fred, your colleague student.
Fred.
Who was
Fred would have been a phenomenal target because he was a bright guy and a rabid, radical conservative. This is the kind of person that you recruit under false flag. I mean, in other words, you tell him that you're working for some country like Israel, and you just need information, blah, blah, blah. We're friends with the US, but we need, they keep stuff from us and blah. This is false flag recruiting. It works really well, but you need somebody who is, the best targets are individuals with a strong ideology one way or the other. I also met some folks that had communist leanings. There was a fellow who came over from Cyprus, a really bright guy, and he was a hardcore communist. And I'm guessing that they actually tried to do something with him, because one time I went back to Moscow and they asked me to find where he moved. So I actually went to speak to his brother, who lived at the address where that fellow used to live, and that was an indication that there was something going on. One more thing, and that I never knew whether that's valid or not. I believe it really wasn't, but the fact that I lived in the U.S. as an American was valuable to them, because there were moments during the Cold War when the relations were really in danger, and there was a possibility that their mutual that the U.S. would kick out all the diplomats, and that means all the spies, and vice versa. But I never had any instructions what to do in a case like that. How they would, they would obviously, through shortwave, they probably would have told me, blah, 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 this and that. And I had a couple of tasks where my ability to move around in the country freely was of value. That twice they asked me to look for somebody, and there was this fellow. Now I forgot his name. It was a KGB defector who wound up teaching at the university in California. He was under a death sentence, and they asked me to find out whether he was still teaching there, and his address and some other information. And I did, but I was much later when I was free from the KGB. I found out that he passed away from natural causes, which was a relief to me, because why would they want to find out where he is? Somebody in the KGB thought, they might still want to kill him. So there was some marginal value in that respect. When I look back, I always had guilt feelings, as I didn't really accomplish much, but now I'm saying, thank God.
Yeah. Otherwise, the guilt would really catch up. But I mean, so the period during which you were operating was so from 1978 to 1988, I believe that Gorbachev started with his perestroika and glasnost,
Right.
Somewhere after 85. But I mean, you were there during several, so to speak, in vague terms, fluctuations. How did you, during, the shifting climate in the Cold War, and during the everyday, tasks and everyday conversations, as as you said, as a computer analyst, how did you keep your own cover? Did your cover ever, or have you noticed your cover being close to being, shown, or, how did you keep it? How did you keep yourself a secret, basically?
Well, the longer I operated in the U.S., the easier it became. There was only one case during that entire 10-year period where a friend of mine once came into my office and said, Jack, there's something doesn't add up. There's something not quite right with your story. I don't know what it is, and I'm not going to look to find out. That didn't scare me, but because at the time I was already so well integrated, it would have taken somebody to actively investigate, like, my backstory. For instance, I told them, I would tell people if they asked me, I went to this particular high school and I worked at that particular farm for 10 years. None of that could have been verified, but private individuals didn't do it. I got lucky in that, for instance, when I graduated as valedictorian, that no journalist wanted to interview me and ask me all kinds of questions, or one of those investigative journalists, or that somebody from law enforcement, FBI, CIA, this is kind of an odd individual. Americans are just very trusting, and that helped also. So it wasn't hard at all. And if it hadn't been for Vasily Mitrokhin, the archivist from the KGB, taking that information to the FBI, I would be right now. I would be a retired information technology executive who never left the country, and had a rather second half of his life rather normal, boring, and I wouldn't be talking to you.
Nobody would have known, basically. But like, okay, so that's in regards to keeping your cover. It's a mixture of, as you said, luck and of course skill and the building of trust between people. But in terms of, let's say, for instance, and this is something that I'm really interested in terms of the spycraft or the technical skills that involve spying, the field operations.
Yeah.
How did the field operations look like? You mentioned previously, you know, looking for surveillance while you're trying to make like the drop or an exchange with somebody else. Could you explain to us perhaps like what are field operations and what do they usually consist of?
Well, primarily we're talking about three different types. We're talking, but at the core is the counter surveillance. Trying to find out whether you're being followed, investigated. I had that had nothing to do with running around in the city and looking for people to follow you. I had a couple of marks in my apartment, and where I would find out that somebody had actually gone through my apartment. There's one of them, and it's not to proverbial hair but at the door. That doesn't work. But I had a chest of drawers that was constructed in such a way there was an overhang, and you couldn't really see, unless you really looked at this thing before you opened the drawer. You would think the drawer was completely closed. You couldn't see whether it was a little bit open. And I had it, I remember this, 8 millimeters open. So if somebody opens that drawer and closes it, the 8 millimeters would not be the same. And the first thing when I got home, I would check for the 8 millimeters. I also, the shortwave radio that I had, which was commercially available, it was placed on a table at an exact distance. So this is part of making sure that you don't have to worry. One other means I used was one time and to find out whether somebody opened the mail that came to me. So what you do in that case, you write a letter to yourself from a fictitious address, and then you close the letter, but you leave a couple of that glue strip not moist. So in other words, that glue is still there. Mm-hmm. The way they open letters is mechanically with devices, and then they glue them back. So when you get that thing, that letter, and there isn't a dry strip left, it means that letter was opened. Mm-hmm. So that was that, for any operation outside meetings, I was supposed to make sure that I wasn't being followed. And the debt drop, was a very high precision type operation. Let's suppose it was planned for 3:15. Let's say I'm the recipient of something that they want to give to me. So at 3:10, I would walk past a signal spot where the person who placed the container in the spot, the debt drop spot, made a signal say that the container is there. If I don't see the sign, I go home. By the way, every one of those operations worked except for the very last one, which is kind of odd. But anyway, so I now make a beeline to that place, and it's got to be a spot that is easy to describe and easy to find. The very first one was a hollow tree in a park in Manhattan. Like at the base, there was a big hole, and the agent who I was working with put a crushed old oil can in there. So I knew that was for me. I picked it up, and then I go to another spot and set the signal that I picked it up. I emptied the drop. and within 5 minutes later, the agent would go past that spot. If the signal is not there, he would have to go back and retrieve the container. And they all worked like clockwork. I mean, my partners were well trained, and I always wondered, they were most likely either employees of the United Nations or Soviet diplomats with diplomatic cover, how they managed to always be there, because they were known to the FBI to be agents. And finally, I'm now friends with somebody who worked in New York, who was a part of the team that was covering Russian KGB. And he said, the way they did it, they sent out 24 people at the same time. The FBI didn't have enough folks to cover them all. And one of them would be free to do this in some way. That's what they did. They worked with volume. Mm-hmm. I thought maybe you put 4 people in a car and then you drop people off at certain places where they then jump into the subway. That might also have worked, but it always worked, except for the last one.
What happened on the last one?
Well, I was still uncertain as to whether I should go back home or I should stay with my daughter. And so at one time I got a radiogram that said, we're going to do an operation on that day. Unlike all the others, it was in the dark. At that spot, which I had selected, which I knew exactly where it was. And I was told that I was very good at describing to others that, those spots. And what they were going to give me in that drop was a passport and money, travel money. So I figured, I hadn't made a decision yet, but I might as well, take the money, right? It was dark. Maybe it was a Saturday. I think it was on a weekend. So this was on Staten Island. It's a separate island next to Manhattan. It's part of New York, and in a park. And I go there with a flashlight, and I make it. The sign was set, so I'm going to go and pick up that container, and it wasn't there. And I couldn't believe it, because that was unusual. So I searched around for a while. There were no people in that park at that time, and it wasn't there. And this is the moment where I made the decision that I'm going to stay. It's really, really interesting how this all developed. Divine intervention, believe it or not, I sort of believe it, but you can choose to whatever. It's another coincident, accident, but it's a really odd one.
Yeah, to happen in that moment of time within
exactly right.
Dilemma.
To just give me the final nudge, when the scales is like this, and all of a sudden somebody puts 1 gram over here and it goes like that.
But I mean, because we're over our 1 hour of conversation, I would like us to close into a question that I really think is really, really important for people to understand, in order to understand both your life and the life of spies, not just of KGB, but of spies everywhere. And that is the mental and emotional solitude and the way that actually the life of a spy leads. Could you tell us a little bit more about it? Is this the thing, this emotional solitude that people don't get most often in regards to the spying job, so to speak?
You're absolutely right. Most people can't do what I did. Cannot. And even the KGB preferred to send couples. So at least there were people that, they could talk with one another. They wouldn't do it in their own apartment. They wouldn't do it inside, but they might go to a park and that's emotional comfort. They actually, and I don't want to open that can of worms, but I was married in Germany. They thought initially that they would send us as a couple, but she didn't qualify. She was psychologically not strong enough. So here's what if you hear something, my wife is just printing something.
It's all right. It's all right.
This is where they found somebody who can handle this. I grew up not as a lonely child, but I grew up in the country with a brother with whom I had very little relationship. There weren't a lot of friendships because your friends were like far away from you. My parents were cold. My grandparents were cold. So I grew up emotionally underdeveloped. Rather, I didn't have a lot of attachment, so to speak. And I never had a problem leaving. So the lure of what was coming was much stronger than what kept me back. I was a very social kind of guy while I was in college. I was one of the fun people. I played the guitar. I led the whole group and songs. I played basketball. I was socially very active. But when I went to Berlin, I was by myself. I had some interaction, but they were one-on-one with other people. I didn't go to work. I didn't have a team. And I found out that wasn't a big deal. Now, Moscow was even worse. I had almost no interaction, I had no social interaction, literally. The only interaction I had was with my English tutor and with my handler.
Were these interactions forbidden by the KGB, or you just didn't have time nor the energy to make these connections, to make the interactions?
Well, it's not like you got to be really careful. Deep friendships are very dangerous in every situation, because eventually people will find out. When I dated the woman that I married in Germany, I spent quite a few nights at her place, and then I went with her. She was working at Humboldt University, and next door, not too far away, was the I don't know what's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or something. My cover story was that I was studying to be a diplomat, and I disappeared in that direction, and then I went home to my place. How do you sustain this long term? And particularly, you just can't be very close to anybody. In Moscow, I didn't speak Russian. I learned a little Russian, passive Russian. And what do you do again? What do you tell people? I told my German folks that I worked at the East German embassy in Moscow. First year in New York, I had almost no human contact because I didn't have documentation. I stayed in a single room occupancy hotel where you paid by the month. I left that place every morning, weekday morning, at around 8 o'clock, and it came back after 6. So to give the impression as if I had something to do, which I didn't. So I wandered around in the city. I got to know the city. I spent a lot of time in movie theaters. And
that was I'm sorry, but that was something that really was funny for me when I was reading. You mentioned like watching TV, being in the movies and so on and so forth, and you put it in like italics under quotation marks, like called cultural enrichment. Although I think that was the case once you were in Canada, actually. So that was really funny. Really, really good time.
Yeah, and anyway, getting back to my youth, particularly when the weather was bad and you couldn't play outside, I spent hours and hours, and my mother would tell me that from early on, playing board games by myself. You know, I had teams running around the board, and then I made and I had tables like leagues, and and I had my favorites, but I always was honest. And when my favorite lost, I was sad. So I was really able to spend a lot of time with only my brain, so to speak. And that, knowing that, I knew that, made me confident that I would be able to survive American prison.
Mm.
You know, there's one thing is to think about Russian prison, or the place where that used to be Yugoslavia. That is difficult, but American prison, you know, they treat you much nicer. So I can't explain it in any other way. What I thought was really interesting. I thought for the longest time that recently that I was an introvert, because I had sort of developed introversion tendencies, because as a spy you can't be so close to others, right? But once I was out in public, my old extroverted self woke up again, and I'm now down here in the south of the United States. I make friends easily. I talk to strangers. You know, I'm more comfortable in my own skin. I'm the most comfortable in my own skin as I've ever been. That's a good thing. I once was given a battery of psych tests by psychologists that the FBI hired. I've been asking for the results of those tests, and they're taking forever. I mean, this is not a secret, right? But I'm really interested in what they found out, because you know, if you lived a life like I did, it's kind of really hard to understand who you are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I mean, looking back on your life and looking back on your career as a undercover KGB agent, looking at it retrospectively from this point, would you repeat it again? If you were to travel back to the past and that knock on the door and that guy in Moscow, I remember the fat guy who was really short asked you, "Are you in or out?" Would you say
right? Right. Well, you got to understand, if I go back in time knowing what I know now, I would say absolutely not even a thought. even if the United States were to ask me to do something similar, I would respectfully decline, because that's a suicide mission. And on top of it, you know, if you come out of it, you come out damaged in some way. This is not, you know, you don't. I have psychological baggage that I don't want to necessarily get into. Just a hint. I had for the longest time I had problems with alcohol, and that's not unusual. So a lot of in espionage, there's a lot of drinkers, a lot. So knowing what I know now, I would not advise anybody, and I would not do it myself. But if you dial back my brain, who I was then, of course I would do it again.
It's that longing for adventure, and I think that people, especially youth and especially young men, I mean, I can only speak from a perspective of a young guy, is that, you know, the call to adventure, the call to test your own limits has to be fulfilled in some way. And just as you mentioned, just as you quoted, I can't remember his last name, Kim Philby,
yeah.
You know, once you're asked to join such an elite force, it's really tough to say no. I mean, it's tough to say from your own perspective now, but back then.
Let me tell you, I have been asked by maybe a handful of young people whether I would recommend that they become CIA operatives. And my answer is not a straight no. I said, but be prepared if you do that. And it's interesting, it's challenging. It's something that very few people get to do, but be prepared that your country your government may ask you to do something which is against your core moral values. Because it happens. The game is dirty. No matter how clean you think you want to play it, the other side plays dirty, and eventually you will touch some of that dirt. And that's a decision that they have to make. And if they and there's plenty of young people who make that decision, and I'm not condemning them at all.
Yeah, it's up to them to consult their own character and their own virtues. Thank you, Jack. Thank you for this wonderful conversation, and thank you for this insight at the end. Before we finish, might there be anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners and viewers?
Well, I was asked that question once, and I wasn't prepared to answer, but now I am. And it sounds really corny, but this is my number one life lesson. And it's being said by many people without really understanding what it means. And it's that love conquers all. Because ultimately my decisions were all driven either by lack of love or eventually in the end by deep love for others.
It's a wonderful message, and I totally agree. I mean, basically, so that we don't get like philosophical here, but it's like you mentioned it really, really well. Love, whether or not it's a lack of or abundance of love, drives things, and as long as we're aware of that, we might be able to go on the right path.
Yeah, well, good luck with what you're planning to do in life. Stay in touch. Maybe one day we'll meet in person.
Yeah, hopefully so. Maybe here, maybe in Germany. Thank you very much, Jack.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.